good morning. My name is Doug Cox. I work for the Menominee Tribe. I'm the Environmental Program Coordinator, as I said yesterday. Before I get into the presentation, I'd like to tell you a little bit about myself, my experience in environmental code and policy development, and some outside of environmental policy development experiences that I do have. So I've worked for the tribe for about 21 years in natural resources programs in various capacities, including my current one. I've spent about 20 years on the tribe's Conservation Commission, most of those as chairperson. The Conservation Commission is actually the entity for Menominee that's responsible for recommending and developing regulations regarding hunting, fishing, trapping, and gathering to the Menominee Tribal Legislature for development and approval. So I spent time there. I also spent time on our strategic planning team as one of the members of that team. I developed the natural resource, helped develop the natural resource portion of that, as well as the integrated natural resource management plan that the tribe currently has in draft form. Also spent some time on the Menominee Tribal Enterprises Board of Directors. Menominee Tribal Enterprises is the forestry division of the tribe, which is overseen by a board of directors, and I spent time as chairperson of that board as well, where we made quite a few internal and external regulations regarding our forest. So I've had a little bit of experience there, and we'll dive into the presentation. The overview, I'm going to talk a little bit about the history. I'm not going to try to spend too much time on history. I think in terms of where I am and the group I'm speaking to, I can feel like I'm preaching to the choir here when I start talking about history. But I know some of you probably haven't seen a lot of history reference in Menominee, and I want to try to keep it toward why we're in the natural resource arena and code development. So the historical component will be covered there. I want to talk about our sovereign governmental authority and powers, and also talk about why it's important to regulate. Okay. So what I always like to talk to groups about when we speak about Menominee's place on the landscape, and that's important to define when we start talking about anything related to our regulation, is why we are here and what brought us to where we are today. So the most of the attention when it comes to Menominee Resources is on its forestry because of the sustainability aspect. Menominee is often recognized as the leaders in the area of forest management because of our sustainability, and that's absolutely correct. But what's often forgotten there is, as part of our sustainable management of our forest, that people don't concentrate on the fact that in that forest is the rest of our resources. And a lot of us that work in the field know that, but a lot of folks that hear presentations about forest and sustainability forget about that aspect. So I always remind people that there's water there, there's wildlife there, there's vegetation there, and there's historic resources there that have also been maintained as long as we've been there. So those are important things that I like to remind folks about. So our records that we utilize throughout our history relate to everything you would expect them to relate to. Our oral history, you know, we as tribes depend on that very much in our setting vision for the future. Our oral history and our elders really dictate where we're going and where we've been. Those are very important things. The unfortunate part of that, as we realized through the years in working in this arena, is a lot of that history, when it comes from our oral history, was not written. So it's handed down and handed down and handed down, and it's important for us to hang on to that and carry that forward. And that makes Menominee's place important on the landscape, because we have those embedded in our legends and in our, again, through our elders, through our philosophies as tribes that a lot of us look at as the 7th generation philosophies, and in our creation story. So the Menominee creation story particularly places us on a landscape at the mouth of the Menominee River, the Wisconsin-Michigan border. So you can see our place on the landscape, why it's important, which is going to lead me into speaking about why it's important for us to protect these resources that we have. So there we are in northeastern Wisconsin. So historically, the tribe occupied a large portion of Wisconsin, as did a lot of you in the room here. And through history, we shared this landscape, with everyone that was there in pre-settlement times. It's noted that Menominee occupied about 9 million acres of area there. You can see that map depicts some of that area. The map actually is a depiction of our ceded lands, so by year, that just shows some of those areas that were ceded by treaty, not certainly the entire 9 million acres. Menominee occupied area in Wisconsin, upper Michigan primarily, but we're also documented to be south as far as Illinois. That's hard to see. There's black dots on that map. This is a traditional village site map that was created through some of our historical records. Those black dots, just for reference purposes in this presentation, I like to note to people that those black dots, if you look closely, are all oriented to waterways, lakes, or the Bay and the Great Lakes. So Menominee were here for the purpose of being on the landscape because we're hunter-gatherers and fishers, much like most of our tribes here in the Great Lakes states. We still are today, but this map really depicts that importance of being on a landscape near those areas where we were able to sustain a lifestyle that was tied to the resources. Which again, my point being that moving forward, our move toward more modern type of regulations and protecting those resources are still based on that old philosophy and that old lifestyle of being hunters, fishers, and gatherers, and the importance of protecting the landscape just within the 225,000 acres of land that we occupy today, which is the Menominee Reservation. Some of the important figures that we look toward in moving forward, looking back in our history, one of those individuals was one of our chiefs, Chief Oshkosh. He was a chief during the treaty era that did a lot for Menominee in creating this place on the landscape we occupy today. As with many tribes during the treaty era, the movement in the treaties realized that a lot of tribes went from their actual homelands to a foreign place and didn't really have a lot of choice in the matter. In Menominee's case, our leaders during that era, one of them being Chief Oshkosh, actually lobbied, although the term wasn't lobby obviously then, making trips to Washington to meet with the president with some of other Menominee leaders. And those trips were met with fruition. They were out there stressing the importance of our land and where we were on the landscape. They were met with assertions that the Wolf River was important to the Menominee, that the sturgeon was important to the Menominee, that the wild rice were important to the Menominee. So it really set the tone for Menominee to have a victory of staying on this landscape where we considered it to be our central homeland. And it also set the landscape for future policies that the tribe was able to resist and fight against. Some of those policies you heard Samantha talk about yesterday that were really blows to Indian country, the Allotment Act, assimilation attempts, Public Law 280. All of those things today, Menominee has fairly successfully resisted, relative in terms, resisted. We've all been reduced to reservation lands, but in Menominee's case, we're able to resist allotment. In Wisconsin, we're the only tribe that isn't Public Law 280. We're the only tribe that isn't checkerboard. And again, we owe those victories to our past leaders and those lessons that we have to carry forward in our policies and code developments today. Constantly have that in mind. What did they want for us, and what do we need to carry on for our future generations? So specifically, some of the other attempts in policy that the government put in place in more modern history, one of those that we weren't able to be victorious over was the Termination Act. In 1954, President Eisenhower passed the Termination Act, and that affected many, many tribes in the United States, including Menominee. So in 1954, we were terminated from federal recognition, basically telling every tribal member in the Menominee Nation that you're no longer a tribal member, that you're a citizen of the United States. You don't have any more, the government has no more federal responsibilities to you. And at that time, they were told that you're to develop a economic base, a policy base, a law base on your own to protect what previously we had known for 100 years as being the Menominee Reservation. So sort of ironic, 100 years after the Treaty of the Wolf River was signed at Kashina Falls in Kashina, the government said, no, we take that back. You're no longer a tribe. So, those are the kinds of stresses and events that occurred at Menominee. This one in particular, that forever changed how our tribe would move into the future, not only as a nation, but in policy and code development. Fortunately, in 1973, the Restoration Act was signed by Richard Nixon. As tumultuous as his terms were to Menominee, he's looked at as a hero for restoring our status as a tribe in a federally recognized reservation. Unfortunately, the long-lasting effects, as I said, to Menominee had serious impacts, not only on the individuals in the tribe, but on our land. We lost a big chunk of the 220,000 acres to basically fee status lands. That land is Legend Lake. It's about 5,000 acres, that most of which no longer is held in trust for the tribe. We are buying some of those properties back today, and we are able to regulate in those areas today through our tribal governmental powers. So at that point, we began reforming tribal government. The Menominee started down a path of developing a constitution, a really tough time in the tribe's history there, that constitutional development and the sort of division of groups within the Menominee tribe was pretty historic at that time. Fortunately, that was resolved, and a lot of that came together by 1977 when the Constitution was adopted and ratified by the United States as a tribal constitution. So it was formed after the governmental model. Our Constitution actually looks a lot like the Constitution of the United States. That was some of the division that occurred when development of it. There were a lot of folks that weren't happy with us modeling a constitution after the same government that previously had terminated us. So you can see how that would easily start to destructure some of the tribal entities and the tribal people when told we're going to model our constitution after the United States. We did manage to retain and build in a lot of tribal verbiage in our constitution. As one tribal member, putting my policy hat down and my government hat down, I can tell you that I don't like the Constitution the tribe has. There are good things about it. I don't like it because it's a Europeanized document that doesn't fit a tribal structure, a tribal nation. I would have certainly preferred a general council traditional structure in our own constitution, but again, it's what we have. It's ever changing. Tribal people have a lot of input in changing this document, and it is ever changing. We talk about it every year. Again, it formed in 1977. The first Menominee Tribal Legislature was then seated in 1979, a 9-member legislature. So as we move into more modern times today, we have a tribal strategic plan that's sort of the big umbrella that we look at as what is our directions. That strategic plan helps us in every area within the tribe. Every area you can think of: social services, human resources, and of course natural resources, which is what I'm concentrating on today when I talk about the policies of the tribe. That overarching mission and vision kind of affirms that pretty solidly: to promote, protect, and preserve our rights, resources, and culture by utilizing responsible leadership and judicious exercise of our sovereign powers. So if that doesn't really jump out at you as a mechanism to assert our powers and to regulate, I don't know what really would. So the Constitution, the strategic plan in line with the Constitution asserts that in Article 3 of the Constitution, the powers of government are outlined. Particularly Articles 1 and 3 of our Constitution identify that the power of tribal government is to regulate within the boundaries of the Menominee lands. And there's also a clear separation of powers in our Constitution, which is critical. So separating that judicial and that legislative branch are something that our Constitution does as well. Our law enforcement branches are very solid. We have a tribal and a county law enforcement within Menominee. Our boundaries contiguous, so it's one and the same. Menominee County is the Menominee Reservation, and that law enforcement is shared within the reservation. We also have conservation warden staff within the reservation, which is about 7 wardens strong today. So our tribal codes and policies are laid out in our tribe, and you can see them through our website. What I'd like to do is show you that really quickly. Hopefully the link will work if you just click right there. So here's our website. If you go over to links, the link button, this is the tribal website. So if you scroll over to the link tab, one more over, and click on that, and then scroll down, and you'll see E-codes. If you click on E-codes, this is all public information, so if you're interested in seeing our codes, there they are. The tribe codified its laws recently. We were formed, before that we had ordinances and just a couple codes. They were scattered everywhere, so if you wanted the conservation ordinance, you had to find them between the environmental, the land use, the conservation department. Today, all the codes are codified in one place and also digitally available for us. Most of them digitally available for us right on the website. Codes in the Menominee are numerous. I'm sure that's not a lot different than other tribes here, but we've got the A to Z range from administrative policy code all the way to zoning. So, you know, they're there. But again, that's the website. If you want that website later, I know it's hard to see up here, I can get that to you. But if you just Google Menominee Indian Tribe of Wisconsin, you'll get to our website and follow the links, and you'll see those there. So we need to go back to our PowerPoint. Okay. So particularly my interest is environmental codes. Some of those that we have out there are related to water resources, conservation codes, land resources, and zoning. So in surface water, we've got wetlands, groundwater. We do regulate high capacity wells. We regulate sanitation systems, septics. In our conservation field, as I mentioned before, we have specific laws regulating hunting, fishing, trapping, and gathering, and seasons related to each one of those. And in land use, we have zoning that regulates everything from solid waste to your basic fee development, or excuse me, parcel developments that you would expect to see there. This has been talked about quite a lot in the last couple of days. We do have surface water standards. Our surface water standards today are tribally approved. I know Lac du Flambeau has TAS approval currently. Menominee is pursuing treatment as a state approval. What that basically that means is that the Clean Water Act authorizes tribes to have federal designation to regulate its waterways, and Menominee is moving in that direction. That's also available to tribes in air standards. I think there may be a tribe here that has air approved standards as well. And 401 certification in the water quality arena is something that Menominee is interested in. And I think that TAS and water quality standards, when tribes get that approval, the first thing that we look at is that the impact that we could have through 401 certification. What 401 certification allows us to do is to have a hand in regulating off-reservation activities for waterways that impact our reservation. So upstream uses that are usually federally permitted, some cases states, but federally permitted upstream activities need to look toward tribes for that 401 certification. In Lac du Flambeau's case, that would be one of the approved tribes in Wisconsin that holds that today. Bad River also holds that authority. And in a recent example of the proposed mining activity that's going on up there, when that Army Corps 404 permit gets issued or gets proposed, they're going to have to meet Bad River's water quality standards because of 401 certification. And that activity will not be able to be permitted until that requirement is met. So you can see the strength that tribes can get out of this type of certification. And Menominee is definitely looking toward that. Our chapter, by the way, it's not an ordinance anymore, so it's chapter 512, surface water standards. So if you get to that code site, look for 512, you'll see it. We do currently regulate under that ordinance within the boundaries. We regulate everybody. Doesn't matter your status, tribal, non-tribal, contractors. Everybody is expected within our boundaries to come in and under our water quality ordinance required to get a permit. This is an example of a permit application. We do that for surface water and storm waters. Wetlands are also regulated within our standards. So any activities within the boundaries we have jurisdiction over. And again, the message here, for my presentation is the importance of protecting our resources. This is the Wolf River. I don't know if anybody's ever been to this site, Smoky Falls, where they're kind of centralized on the Menominee Reservation. We have several of these scenic areas within the Wolf River on the reservation. You can see why Chief Oshkosh and the tribe wanted to protect this. Today we protect these kinds of sites from recreational use. There's quite a bit of recreational use through boating, through rafting on the Wolf River. And the tribe protects that through a boating rafting ordinance, code chapter 268 that helps protect that resource and regulates how individuals use that resource. Watershed map of the reservation, you can see pretty extensive. These are just the main waterways. These don't show the smaller springs and the spring-fed streams that are there. We've got about 300 miles of trout streams within the reservation. Again, all regulated under Chapter 512. So activities within that are protected there. I also like to use this slide as a message of that it's not just about what we protect, but it's about protecting our waterways for our neighbors, because all those waters that flow in also leave somewhere. And we have receiving neighbors that expect water to be clean regulatorily as well as politically. And it's good for us to keep our waters clean for not only our own future generations, but for our neighbors too. More modern type of stuff, we have a hydropower facility just a couple miles below the reservation. It was a federally permitted facility, which takes us to other policies again. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission issues licenses for these kind of activities. In the early 90s, we got involved with this one through the environmental assessment, through NEPA. Something else that was talked about pretty extensively. So we got involved in NEPA on this one. We were able to successfully execute some terms in the license that was issued to this project that have protective measures for reservation resources, which is what it's all about. We have fish passage requirements for this facility that are due to be in by 2020. Sounds like a long ways off, it's not. And the other things that we did was settlement agreements with the owner there that helped the tribe protect its resources and realize some resources. They occupy reservation land. The project's required to pay the tribe for that land that it occupies. Some of the other federal acts were pretty well discussed, so I'm not going to go into those a lot due to my time. But Endangered Species Act, NHPA, of course, is the big one, is the reason we're all here. Non-point source pollutions are important. Those again are regulated through a number of codes in the tribe. We have a Chapter 340, that's a forest management code that helps us regulate non-point source activities from our forestry operations. I mentioned MTE. They do forest activities on almost the entire 220,000 acres, and that code helps us regulate that. We do that through BMPs. So we have BMP's best management practices for forestry activities built into Chapter 340, as well as Chapter 512 that I mentioned previously. Our standards, I should mention, our water quality standards also have a designated use in them protecting cultural and spiritual activities. So we have designated a cultural and spiritual use in our water quality standards. And that's a protective mechanism that will further add to the importance of the tribe's ability to keep undertaking those activities and assuring that our water is clean for those types of activities. So that's important as well. Invasive species I'm actually going to talk about a little later. So we have policies dictating how we're dealing with invasive species today. So I certainly took up enough time. Sorry about the length of the presentation, but we have a lot of land. Thank you.